Dear colleagues, joining us for the second international webinar organized by Faculty of Economics, Business and Tourism, University of Split, and supported by Croatian Section of European Regions Association. Being developed in response to the changing needs, this webinar is designed to promote dialogue among top scientists and society, allowing participants to pose the questions the presenter can answer in real time, learn what others are doing, and gain advices on how to make the best decision for our local community. Keeping in mind our goals, I'd like to introduce today's Andrés Rodríguez-Pose. Andrés is Professor of Economic Geography at London. He is the past President of Regional Science Association International. He also served as the Vice President and Secretary of European Regional Science Association. He is a regular advisor to the European Commission, European Investment Bank, Alliance, OECD, International Labour Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, and Inter-American and Development Bank of Latin America. He was awarded in 2018 ERSA Prize in Regional Science, arguably the highest prize in the region. He is the editor of Economic Geography and sits on the editorial boards of 33 other journals, including many of leading geography, human geography, regional science, and management. Finally, Andrés is ambassador of the Faculty of Economics, Business and Tourism, and now a dear friend, and therefore it gives me great privilege to announce his speech today under the title Institutions and Fortune of Territories. Before we start, a few technical organization tips. We will have 35 minutes for presentation, and after you will have opportunity to ask the questions. Please, just to be on safe side, mute your microphone, but please turn on your camera during the presentation. In the left corner, you have both icons. After the presentation, you will kindly ask to turn again your microphone and start with the discussion. So thank you very much. Andrés, the online stage is just yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Venko. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's very nice to see you all, at least the ones I can see at the top, all in good shape and doing well in this period. And I'm glad to see that Croatia in general, and especially Split, is doing much better than the place where I am at the moment, which is Madrid, or the place where I work, which is London. Hopefully we can get out of this nightmare and return to a normal life in the near future, and I think you're probably leading the way. I hope everyone can hear me well. As Vinko said, please mute your microphones. If there's any problem, just let me know. I'm muted and tell me I cannot hear you, or you've been frozen, so please can you repeat what you've said. I've also opened, you have a chat. I would appreciate if you have any questions or any doubts, you can put them in the chat. And then either I can, when we finish, I can say, please, Josip or Lydia or Martina, ask the question that you ask on the chat. Or if you have, after that, you can unmute your microphone and talk. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen so you can have my presentation. So hopefully now, and let me just now make the screen bigger on this side. Sorry. Okay. Now it's just when I changed everything, so I got two screens to be able to see you all. Okay. Okay, so I can see that the people, Sanya is also joining us, so people from Zagreb are joining, so that's actually very good. So let me just talk about institutions and the fortunes of territories, which you have here in front of you. And I'm going to start with presenting a problem. What is the problem? One of the big problems that we're facing within regional science, within regional studies today. And the main problem is that over the last, I would say, 3-4 decades, we have become much bigger. I remember when Sanya organized the famous European Regional Science Conference in Zagreb in 2001. I think it was my first year as Secretary of ERSA. Then we had about 300 participants. Now we go to 1,000 participants. We're bigger, it's a plentiful sort of group. And we are not just more, we got better theories, we got better data, and we got as well much better methods to analyze. But despite that, what we're finding is that our capacity to explain how jobs and how growth has been increasing, rather than being bigger, is becoming smaller. Let me explain. In theory, depending on which sort of theory we believe in, jobs and economic growth are depending on a series of factors. The first one would be physical capital. And you have it here, which is mainly proxied by infrastructure. That's what the neoclassical school of growth is proposing, that the more you build infrastructure, and especially physical infrastructure, the more you grow. Then we had the endogenous growth theory, which put all the emphasis on either human capital or innovation. And on top of that, we had a part that we didn't know, that we couldn't explain with our analysis, which is known as the error term or the residual factor. What has happened over time? Over time, the funny thing is that despite better theories, better methods, more researchers, and much better data, our traditional factors behind the theories of economic growth explain much less. Once we put physical capital, we put human capital, and we put innovation into our growth equations, we explain less of economic growth and employment generation. And what has grown is our error term, our residual factor. In fact, when you take a look and you put, for example, in the case of Italy, at provincial level, into any type of analysis, you put infrastructure, human capital, and innovation, what you get is you explain virtually nothing. When in the 1970s, you would explain about 80 to 90% of all the variation. So this is a paradox. We have improved in theory, but we explain less. And this is having an effect because we have policies that, despite their problems, have generally worked, but there has been a decline in the levels of returns to, let's say, investment, to intervention, in many of the main axes in which we have put money and resources over the last few decades, especially in the case of infrastructure. And there are plenty of examples. I don't have to go very far. I am, after all, Spanish, so I like to put examples of a country like Spain, which I would say has now, with Portugal, the best physical infrastructure, best transport infrastructure in the world, both in terms of relative to its population, relative to GDP. But despite now what are 3 decades of solid construction of infrastructure, which is what the neoclassical economic growth theory would have told us, what we find is that the country has not done particularly well. It caught up for 15 years to the rest of the European Union. Then even with the crisis, it hasn't done particularly well. In contrast, what we have is, for example, Portugal, which is probably in terms of motorways per GDP and population better than Spain and much better than any other country in the European Union, is a country that, despite this massive effort into building infrastructure, has done actually not particularly well. It has done worse than Spain and has not grown, or has grown very, very little over the last 2 decades. Here you have several examples. Spain has got, outside China, the longest network of high-speed rail in the world, but many high-speed rail stations are like this one you see over here. This is the station at the Expo in Seville, which was used once by a high-speed rail train, that was in 1992 for the opening of the Expo. Since then, it hasn't seen a single passenger. So it has remained empty. But we have plenty of examples in this drive to build high-speed rail. There was this connection between Toledo, Cuenca, and Albacete that you can see over here. Toledo is 70,000 south of Madrid. Cuenca is about 40,000 to the southeast of Madrid. And Albacete is the biggest one, it's 150,000. about 150 kilometers, well, 200 kilometers to the southeast of Madrid. And this is a high-speed line that was closed 10 months after it was opened. Why? Because although maintenance cost per day of the line was 18,000 euros, the number of passengers on a daily basis, so one train in each direction, so 2 trains per day, was a total of 9. No, not 90,000, not 9,000, not even 900, but just 9 passengers. Of course, then it was clearly some sort of infrastructure that made no sense from a social political level. This is Madrid, which is now in the European Union after the exit of the UK, is the second largest city, the second largest agglomeration in the European Union with 6.4 million inhabitants. And what you can see here is I work in London, which is double the size of Madrid in population, or almost double the size of Madrid in population. And London has 1 ring road. Here you have Madrid, in which you have 1 internal ring road, which is quite large. You have a second ring road, which is also more than 60 kilometers around the city. You have a third internal ring road that is going to be finished, which is likely to be the second longest tunnel in Europe. And then to the southeast, you have 2 half-ring roads. So in some parts of Madrid, you have 5 roads in parallel, which hardly get congested because there are far too many of them. But you also have motorways going in all directions. And next to the blue motorways, which are free motorways, you have the toll roads, the toll motorways, which are these ones in black. So the one connecting Madrid to Toledo, which is another one of the cities that you saw here before, has an average, a grand total of, because it's a toll road, and you have a perfectly good and straight motorway going, which is free, going from Madrid to Toledo, never gets congested. The traffic on a daily basis in this road in 2018 was about 760 vehicles per day. So we're talking about an amount of traffic that doesn't deserve a secondary road with a dirt track. You will be more than covered. But of course, in Spain, you have a lot of airports, but many of these airports, actually 6 of them, hadn't seen until very recently a single flight. This is the airport in Castellón. And my absolute favorite was the Ciudad Real Airport, which is a PPP, public-private partnership airport, that was open in the late 2000s, that was sold or was put into auction in 2015. And this comes from the Financial Times, so it's no joke, in which the airport that cost $1 billion to build, so 1,000 million euros, attracted an offer in auction. The highest bid was 10,000 euros by a Chinese individual. So it wasn't sold for 10,000 euros, it was put into auction the next year, but it was sold for 40 million euros. So you can see the difference between 40 million and 8 billion euros. That's 960 millions then that were not used. But of course, it can be worse. I've been criticizing Spain, I've been criticizing Portugal, but you have other situations. This is, for example, something from the New York Times about Spain and Italy, and saying how, although in Italy there has been as much investment as there has been in Spain coming from the European Union, Spain has a, let's say, world-class high-speed rail network, whereas in the case of Italy, it has only completed a highway. And of course, you can do the same comparison between Greece and Greece and Portugal, in which in Portugal, the 2 countries are comparable in population. Greece is a bit larger than Italy in levels of development. They receive the same amount of money from the European Union. And after that, Portugal has got the best network of motorways in Europe, 3 motorways in parallel at times between Lisbon and Porto, many of them empty with very limited traffic, but at least they're there. What does Greece have to show for it? In fact, it took them 40 years to complete the main motorway between Athens and Thessaloniki, so most of the money has gone actually missing. So what we're seeing is that we have a lot of better data, a lot of policies that follow what we have been telling, and we're getting, in many ways, less capacity to explain what's going on, and also less returns. Why is that? Because probably what we have done is we have been missing something that explains why this question mark, this residual factor, this error term has been growing over time. And when you put that, what is this behind this error term is fundamentally institutions. That if in Spain we have been using massive amount of resources coming from the European Union, but also because of the principle of additionality coming from the Spanish taxpayer to build one of the best infrastructure networks in the world, but it hasn't yielded the expected returns, is probably because we might not be making the best decisions in terms of where to invest, because the quality of institutions leaves a lot to be desired. That when you have a situation whereby you might have, let's say, not effective rule of law or weak rule of law, you might have inefficient governments, you might have lack of transparency and accountability, and you might have certain levels of corruption. Whatever decisions that are being taken in order to improve the potential for economic development might be mismanaged and not achieve the expected results. And of course, the question is that we all know this, that in Europe, there are significant differences in the quality of institutions across countries. And we know that there are places that have very strong and very robust and efficient institutions, and there are places with much weaker institutions. But I'm going to refer you to this map over here, which is the map that has been produced now in 3 rounds by the Quality of Government Institute at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, in which it highlights differences in subnational level in one important institution, in this case, quality of government, at a particular point in time. This is the latest round, which is the one that was done for 2017. As you can see, the map that appears is a bit more complex than what we would expect from a simple north-south, east-west divide in the case of Europe. On the one hand, we have places in Europe in which the quality of government is absolutely excellent. This is fundamentally the Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, but also to a certain extent large parts of the Netherlands and parts of, for example, Germany. Here's a state of Lower Saxony, and here's a state of Bavaria, for example. These are areas where, for example, in Sweden, regardless of whether you're in Malmö over here, or you are in Luleå, somewhere around here, or in Karlskrona around here, the quality of government is excellent throughout in the country. At the polar opposite, what you have is not Eastern Europe or is not Southern Europe, but a corner in Southeastern Europe, which is composed mainly by the south of Italy, although it's moving north. You have Lazio and you have Marke over here, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, most parts of Romania, increasingly Hungary, and unfortunately Croatia, in which what you have is some of the worst quality institutions at a subnational level in the European Union. In between those two polar extremes, you have most of the rest of France, most of the rest of the UK and Ireland, now outside of the European Union. What you'll have is also many parts of Germany, in which there are variations, Wallonia and Belgium, and parts of Austria, where the quality is not as, is around the average. And then what you have is also most of the former Central and Eastern European countries to the north of Hungary, from Slovakia to Poland to the Czech Republic and the Baltics, that are significantly better off than what you had or you find in Bulgaria, Romania, for example, the south of Italy. Portugal is close to France. Spain is a case of deterioration. I'm going to go into it because Spain used to belong very clearly to that sort of group in Western Europe where qualities were around the mean. They have deteriorated over time. And we can see this by looking at the transformation. This is the transformation between 2009 and 2013, and you go to 2017 that you saw before. But you can see that first there's some persistence. There's little improvement in the case of the south of Italy or in the case of Romania and Bulgaria. There's little change in the case, for example, of France or parts of Germany, Belgium, or the UK. There is some deterioration in the north of Italy, and there's significant deterioration in the Iberian Peninsula. You can see it here, but mainly not in Portugal, where the change is limited. Is mostly in the case of Spain, in which you can see the shades getting darker, especially in 2017, with a significant deterioration of government quality. And this is something that can be applied not just to Europe, it can be applied virtually everywhere else. This is work I've been conducting also for the case of China, looking at, for example, government efficiency in different cities in China. Anything that's blue implies more developed areas, red, less developed areas, which are very often correlated to levels of GDP, but also in terms of corruption, where you have areas that are highly developed that are also highly corrupt, in contrast to other areas. But it can also be applied to Africa, and this is a bigger project that I'm developing at the moment with some colleagues at the LSE in London, in which you can see differences also in quality of government at some national level within African countries. So how does considering institutional quality actually affect economic outcomes? And there are two types of implications. There are direct implications and there are indirect implications. I'm going to try to deal with both in a very quick way. But before going into it, I'm just going to show you that, I mean, there's a lot of tables here, but I don't want you to bore you with tables. There are a lot of papers. If anyone is interested, I can send you the papers later on. But just to highlight that in all cases, there's a lot of analysis behind to reach the conclusion that I'm going to be highlighting. And you can see more tables over here. So I'm just going to summarize what the main results are. So what are the direct impacts? What are the returns of public policy? How does it affect when you have weak institutions? If you have different quality institutions, it affects what sort of policies you decide to implement. So the better the institutions, the more robust the investment and the type of investment, the more adjusted it's going to be to the needs of the population and the territory. The weaker the institutions, the weaker the quality of government, the weaker the policies are going to be. And that is going to be translated into, in one place, bigger impact, both in terms of growth and in terms of employment. In other places, a much lower impact in terms of both. And this is something that in work I've been doing with Enrique Garcilaso from the OECD, we have found in the case of Europe. So this is the amount of money that is being invested across the European Union, different regions in terms of expenditure. You can see that most regions get very little money, but starting here, you have a number of regions that get more than 80 euros per head per year, 100, 120, 150, and some regions get almost 800. In some cases, it gets too close to 1,000 years of expenditure per year on average from the European cohesion effort. And what we find, and this is very interesting, is that there's a threshold that is very often linked to quality of government. So depending on how much money you put by, let's say, if you put, let's say, this one, 80 euros per head in areas with low cohesion expenditure or in high cohesion expenditure, and you control for the quality of government of the regions, you have the straight lines over here. This is a low quality of government region. The dotted lines are high quality of government regions. The more you invest, the more returns in terms of growth of GDP per head you're getting on average. However, there's a point where that stops. In the case of Europe, where the average investment per head per region is around 100 euros per head per year, once you reach 120 euros, putting more money to improve development doesn't yield any additional returns. You can see here in blue, what you have is that the returns you get from investing in regions beyond 120 euros per head. And in red, you have it up to a limit of 150 euros. you can see that the lines overlap completely, meaning that those additional 30 euros per head of investment don't make any difference whatsoever in terms of economic outcomes. That you're much better off by improving the quality of government. I'm going to give you some examples. For example, these are the different thresholds of investment: more than 80 euros per head, more than 100 euros per head per year, more than 120 euros per head per year, more than 150 euros per head per year. You can see here that if you increase structural fund expenditure by 1 standard deviation, you get additional yields of about 2%, from 2% to about 1.5%. Improving quality of government by the same amount, by 1 standard deviation, goes from 7% to 7% at 100, it goes between 6% and mostly 7%. So you get 3.5 times minimum the returns from investing in improvements in quality of government above the threshold of 80 euros per head as investing in structural expenditures. So there are 2 ways of going about this. Either in order to overcome this problem, you want to increase the budget of the European Union by 2.7 times, that we know is never going to happen, or you have to address the problems of poor governments, which is a much more cost-effective way of making sure that you get direct returns from intervention. The second one is in terms of employment. For example, if you go to employment, the better institutions you have, you're going to generate more jobs, and these jobs are going to be highly skilled, more qualified, and more permanent. If you have weaker institutions, the number of jobs that are going to be generated are going to be more limited and are going to be very often less skilled types of jobs, and jobs that are precarious and very often are linked or lead to vulnerability and lower permanent type of employment. This is something that comes out very clearly in the types of analysis. But you can have a lot of also indirect effects. This is, for example, the indirect impact on innovation policy. We know that most of Europe has pursued an innovation policy that has been based on putting more money into research and development with the aim of achieving innovation outputs measured by patenting or measured by, let's say, greater capacity to do process and product innovations at the level of the firms. In some work I did with Marco Di Cataldo some time ago, what we find is that once you standardize the quality of government, what is interesting is that no matter how much money you put, the returns into R&D, the returns in terms of patenting are strongly mediated by the quality of government of the region where the money is being spent. So, for example, in this case, what you'll find is that for the regions of Europe that are at the 30% bottom level in terms of quality of government, differences in quality of government, because they're so bad, don't make a difference in that much of a difference in terms of changes in patenting applications. For those regions that have very good quality of government, so are above the 80% threshold, you can see that there's also no change. But for the bulk of regions in Europe, those that are located between 30% over here and 80% over here, which is all this mass, quality of government is a fundamental factor behind the transformation of R&D into innovation. Without taking into account that quality of government, what you're going to find is that any type of investment policy that you do for innovation in many regions of Europe is not necessarily going to work or yield the returns that you expect you're going to get. Second one is in the case of infrastructure policies. And this is also work that I've been doing with Riccardo Crescenzi and Marco Di Cataldo. So for example, when you have poor institutional quality, there's a tendency to go for big projects. In places like Portugal or Spain, where the quality of institutions, the quality of government is not particularly good, and in Spain, where it has been deteriorating, you have local governments, regional governments wanting big projects. So what do you build? You build motorways. There's no secondary road building, or virtually no secondary road building in Portugal. Why? Because you have the resources, or you have had the resources to build motorways. But when you go for glitzy projects, you get very little returns in terms of permanent jobs and growth. At the same time that Portugal was building motorways, was building some of the best stadium in Europe for the 2004 European Football Championship, they grew virtually nothing. By contrast, we find that areas, especially in less developed areas of Europe, that have much better quality of government, is not that they don't go for motorways, but they go for a much more balanced portfolio of investments, which includes secondary roads to improve bottlenecks or to resolve development bottlenecks, with a combination of motorways, and that leads to much greater economic growth and more employment generation. And of course, what we have is that you might need, as a result of that, depending on the quality of government, you might need different types of policies for different types of territories. On the one hand, we have areas that have got weak quality of government in Eastern Europe, but are still very much away from, let's say, the technological frontier, from the institutional frontier, that they lack basic endowments in human capital, they lack basic endowments in infrastructure investment, they lack basic endowments in innovation. In those places, so eastern regions in Poland, eastern regions in Hungary, most of Romania, most of Bulgaria, outside the capitals, what you'll find is that so far, doing greater investment in those traditional areas of infrastructure, human capital, and innovation, more R&D, normally works and is promoting significant growth and convergence. In the south of Europe, where many of those deficiencies are no longer existing, we find that putting any additional money on infrastructure or any additional money on investing in R&D and innovation normally doesn't work, and that the biggest areas of investment should be fundamentally improving the quality of government, but also improving human capital. So what you'll need is, depending on the situation and the stage of development of individual regions in Europe, you might need to do very, very different types of policies. So what we found is that if we want to explain why our models have a dwindling capacity to understand reality, if we want to promote much better public policies, we need to look towards institutions and the importance of institutions, because they determine the fortunes of our cities and the fortunes of our regions. And that's, in my view, the way forward. We need to collectively, as a group, as regional scientists, to try to first understand institutional change. This is something we haven't done yet. We are at the moment grappling with how to measure institutions, which is difficult, it's controversial, but I still don't understand why in some cases we're seeing significant institutional improvements. Why, for example, Estonia, that has started from very low levels of development and very low levels of institutional quality, has improved so much its institutional fabric. Whereas a similar country not that long ago, like for example, Latvia, has not managed to do so. But we also need to understand why some parts of Europe, and not just Europe, other parts of the world, have seen significant institutional decline. And here would include Spain, but also north of Italy, where we have seen over the last, especially 2 decades, a significant decline in the perception and the effectiveness of local government and regional governments. So I'm putting again the same map of Spain, in which you can see the decline over here. We also need to understand how this institutional change. The first point was mainly understanding institutional change. So far, the analyses that have been done have been on the static dimension. There has been very limited analysis done on how institutions change, and we need to understand what makes some places improve and other places not improve. And I was putting an example of Estonia as a country that has improved institutions massively versus, for example, Latvia, where that change has not happened. The second one is understanding how institutional change impinges on us. So, for example, how going from, let's say, weak institutions into better institutions, what is the impact of this transformation on jobs and growth, which are the two factors that I normally work on, but also on issues like, for example, regional resilience, on issues like sustainability, both from an economic and social point of view, but also environmental point of view. And these are two fundamental issues, especially in the current COVID crisis, and also on the quality of life of individuals. And you can see here that happy face. The third one is to expand the dimension of institutions, going beyond government quality. At the moment, most of the analysis that have been done at regional level are based on the data that comes from the Quality Government Institute at the University of Gothenburg. This is mainly data on corruption, government efficiency, rule of law, and transparency and accountability. But we need to start thinking about other factors. Factors like, for example, trust and tolerance. Factors like, for example, openness. Factors like, for example, social capital, like this one over here, in which you have different types of social capital that play an important role. So the division that Putnam made in the 1990s between bridging social capital and bonding social capital, which is absolutely fundamental to understand. So we need to go beyond these more formal institutions into more informal institutions that affect the whole of civil society. We also need to understand the mechanisms. At the moment, we've just established some sort of connection. Poor institutions undermine employment generation and economic growth. But what are the exact mechanisms through which this happens? So if we manage to understand those mechanisms, we'll be able to create much better investments and interventions that would facilitate, again, that employment generation, that job generation, but also well-being, sustainability, and resilience at the subnational level and regional level. And then finally, we need to try to learn from this in order to improve policy. We cannot just remain in our ivory towers doing our research and disengaging from civil society. What we need to do is engage with society in order to make sure that whatever we find in which the way of institutions affect civil society and society can then be transformed into far more efficient policies, both directly, so how can we improve our institutions? How can we make our society more transparent? How can we make trust increase so that the transaction costs can be reduced? How can we improve, let's say, the development of social capital in a way that's inclusive, that it doesn't benefit particular groups? But also how, by doing that, we can create policies that are much more efficient in terms of innovation policies, education policies, infrastructure policies, any other types of sectoral policies, industrial policies that lead to much more efficient results. So we need to be able to be ready to advise our decision makers, wherever we are, whether it is in Croatia or at the level of the European Union in Brussels, in order to make sure that we get better policies. But this is something, and I'm going to finish here, that none of us can do alone. I mean, I've been working on this for quite some time now. My interest in institution, my first paper was already when I was a PhD student. Then I stopped for a while, but I've been doing this intensively for the last 10 years, I would say. But it's not that I or anyone else can do alone. We need the help of the whole community. And I would then challenge you to try to work on this, not just in Croatia, but try to bring your expertise, your capacity, your energy into the fray, and make sure that collectively, as a community of regional scientists, we can put our efforts together in order to make sure that we are able to understand how we can make our societies better by improving institutions, and as a result of that, making our public policies far more efficient. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, and I'll be very, very happy to try to answer any questions or any doubts that you have. If you want to ask questions, please unmute your microphones and go directly. I mean,
so thank you, Andrés, and please, I kindly invite all the participants to ask all the questions that they would like to ask now.
Hi, Andrés. I would like if you would comment on. Okay, I'm not sure whether the European Union is aware of your results, and that investment in in physical infrastructure does not improve economic growth. But for example, in Croatia, we are currently building Pelješki Bridge. You know, if you want to go from Split to Dubrovnik, you need to go through Bosnia and Herzegovina. And in order not to need to go through Bosnia, we are building bridge to Peninsula Pelješac. So if European Union is aware of the fact that that won't help Croatia to grow better, would it be better maybe to invest that money in some kind of government quality than to invest in building Pelješki Bridge?
Okay, first, thank you very much, Joseph, for your question. I mean, it's very difficult to comment on individual projects because, as I said, it depends on the type of project and what project is being done. I just want to make sure and make clear that I'm not against infrastructure investment. That in many places you will need infrastructure investment. And I was highlighting how in less developed regions in Eastern Poland or Eastern Hungary or Eastern Slovakia or most of Romania and Bulgaria, and I would include Croatia, probably there's a need to still build infrastructure, improve the infrastructure endowment. And the bridge that you're talking about is probably not being built just for purely economic reasons, but also for political reasons. That you want to avoid, so a part of the country that is detached from the rest of the country, you want to have it connected in a permanent way. And of course, also it's not just political, you would avoid the massive delays that you have at both borders that you have to cross over Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it might make sense. I'm not sure. I cannot comment on that specific. But having said that, I would say that what we have to avoid is that yes, certain type of intervention becomes a drug. And this is where building infrastructure was not bad for Spain or Portugal at the beginning. It became bad when it became some sort of the only solution, the one that was demanded by decision makers. Why was that? Mainly because if you put it in contrast to other types of investments, let's say investment in human capital is not highly visible. And it doesn't normally work as well in terms of you cannot put that you have spent so much money on grants or improving education or on the job training. But if you're right before the election, people want infrastructure, they want to see an airport, or they want to see a new port, or they want to see a new train station, or they want to see a new motorway. And then you can normally get personal returns as a decision maker by cutting the ribbon and inaugurating that infrastructure right before the elections. So that's a big risk in which you end up building infrastructure that doesn't make any sort of economic or social sense just because you want to get some returns. And one of the nice things that I think I've been banging on this, you said, is the European Union aware of this, is in the 2014 reform of the European cohesion policy, there has been a cap on infrastructure building, which is maximum of 50% of all resources being transferred to regions, which I think is very reasonable. And I mean, this cap has gone down to 20% in places like Spain and Portugal, because these were places that were investing, like, for example, Portugal, the continental regions, Portugal, the ones that are in the Iberian Peninsula, not the islands, were spending about 90% of the funds that were coming from the European Union on physical infrastructure. At the same time, that one third of their students in high school were leaving school at the age of 16. So Portugal had the biggest rate of high school dropouts in the whole of Europe, the European Union. At the same time, it was building the best endowment of road infrastructure in the world. And second thing I want to say, this is not a question of money, this is a question of really putting the political and the social will as a society to transform yourselves, to transform ourselves. Because many of the measures that are destined to improve government quality don't cost that much money. I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to put again the case of Estonia. Estonia is still very poor, it still remains one of the poorest countries in the European Union, but it has grown significantly, and it's very innovative. Estonia is one of the countries with the lowest red tape and with the biggest access to e-government. Is up there in the top 3 with Denmark and Sweden, and Finland top 4 in terms of use of e-government by the citizens of Estonia. So we're talking about close to 90%. The contrast is Italy, which is a country that is far richer than Estonia and has got a GDP per head that is above the average of the European Union. But this is a country that hasn't grown for 30 years. Now the question is, why? Because there are a lot of there's a lot of red tape, and there's a lot of, let's say, resistance by those people protecting that red tape to adopt e-government. Italy is third from bottom in terms of use of e-government today. Only Bulgaria and Romania are below Italy. Croatia is above Italy. But the problem is not this third from bottom, is that the 20% or 22% of Italians that in 2018 used e-government is the same percentage that was using e-government in 2008, despite a massive expansion of e-government, of internet use over the last 10 years everywhere in the world. So here is a problem not of money, not of resources, but of resistance by society, and in this case by government and civil servants, to do any type of transformation. Yes, Gordon, I think you wanted to ask a question.
No, I just wanted to say it was really interesting, but I have to go because I have on Zoom, I have a PT8 meeting at 6. So thank you. I didn't just want to leave. I just wanted to say bye and thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, Sanya?
Andrés.
Oh, Leah.
Okay. Well, I'm very clear what you are talking about, but however, I'm wondering, coming from the Croatian situation, of course, what exactly is the first, to build up the social capital or the institutional, that is governmental capital? I mean, one without another can't go on. But I'm afraid that building social capital is something that is much time consuming. I mean, it needs not decades, but maybe centuries. So I'm wondering whether it is possible to enhance to build up the capacity of the governmental structures without building the capacity of the people themselves. At the moment, you have just explained on the case of Italy that no money in the world can't help people, you know, to adopt new technologies and etc. without probably some much deeper changes. So I wonder, have you been doing some kind of researches related to, I don't know, success of a country and the level of development related to social capital, not just the governmental capacity to use the money to do whatever they do?
Yes, well, thank you very much, Lydia, for that question. I think you're raising a very important point, and I'm going to put it in two parts. The first one is, how do we build both together more efficient government and better, a stronger civil society in link with policy? And should we wait for development policy to have a better institutional conditions? And then I'm going to try to link, well, how do we go about building social capital and better institutions, better, let's say, government at the same time? I don't think we can wait, or no one can wait for, let's say, institutional capacity to build on its own. We need to make sure, and we have an opportunity here, which is the European Union cohesion policy that is affecting many other countries in Europe with the lowest institutional quality. We have an opportunity to make sure that we transform our societies from a structural perspective. The only issue that we have here is that we have put everything on the basis of the strategy, we have forgotten the institutions. So what we need is our policy to have a policy that has a significant and an important component, which is an institutional dimension. So how do we go about this? So as we put within any development strategy a part that goes for innovation, a part that goes for human capital, and a part that goes for infrastructure building, we need to put a part that goes into institutional capacity building, which implies, in many cases, some concrete actions. It would be, let's put more focus to increase transparency and to increase efficiency of government, which can be done through e-government. It can be done through a better training of civil servants, making sure that they are aware of. It can be done through processes of helping and supporting processes to reduce red tape. It can be done through mechanisms to expose decision makers and, let's say, civil servants to best, or government officials to best practices by secondment. So improving, let's say, an Erasmus for civil servants. Because at the moment we have, I mean, I'm not going to say the wrong type of Erasmus. We have an Erasmus which is done at university level, which works very well, but it's done at the wrong time in our lives. You put a 20-year-old person from Osijek in a top university in Munich or in Paris or in Gothenburg, and it's very likely that that person is not going to return to Osijek. You put a 35-year-old civil servant married with 2 children, and you send her to Gothenburg, and she's going to learn, and she's going to go back to Osijek within 3 months with better practices. So these are things that can be done, and can be done relatively easily with like limited cost, but they have to be put in policy. And then the question is, how do you go about then, which is the specific question that you ask, moving government and civil society together, this social capital within civil society? It has to be done simultaneously. And I think the good thing about the European Union is that you have an external body that has funding that can create some sort of conditions to make sure that this transformation is done through the policy in a simultaneous way. Because one of the things is that we all know we come from similar countries in terms of institutional quality and behavior, but we all know that improvements in institutions has to come from daily behavior by society, by individuals. And if you see that there's also the will and the capacity to transform at government level, you're going to transform yourself, and vice versa. And that can only come, I mean, it can come internally. In Estonia, it remain internal, but if you wait, you can wait forever, like in the south of Italy. You need to use this opportunity, which is European regional policy, in an intelligent way, to make sure that you put the basis for an improvement of government efficiency, but also for an improvement in the way society behaves and in the way society sees public intervention, in order to make sure that we improve in everything.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yeah, Sanya, you had a question? Yes, you need to unmute your microphone.
Sorry. Excellent presentation, Andrés. You really, you know, we call it in Sridu. You went just to the point. We have great problems with governance. I must say you answered actually my question already partly now when responding to the previous question. But we do have a problem. We're very much concerned with governance because, you know, it's a chicken or the egg issue. Research and development or human capital or everything. Of course, that everything starts from governance. I have a feeling that while working on IPA type projects, while we were really developing our institutions, we were ahead of what we have today now. I think governance deteriorated on all levels. We have cases, of course, like elsewhere. You surely have them in Spain, you have them in Portugal, elsewhere. But for example, just looking at some issues, participatory forms of governance, looking at the strategic planning, what's going on now. We are doing things pro forma, just for the sake of we have to have a strategic plan. Okay, let's invite everybody inside. But the accountability, the ownership issue, here we are not faring. We haven't improved very much. Everybody wants to say, but everybody's included. We are sharing experience. We are having public debates. We are not having them. We are not having at all the debates which are necessary between the scientific community and the policymakers. And there's a feeling that they don't want to hear. They simply are not interested, you know. So what to do in such a situation? Looking at strategic plans, okay, I have my own opinion about this, but it's not a bad idea to have them, of course. That's the reason why we are all evaluators also of operational programs, of other programs. It's like a task, a homework that has to be done by counties, by some cities and so forth, and they will do it. They will ask some institute or some consultancy firm or some faculty to do it for them. There's not, in now 15 years, nearly 20 years, we haven't built this capacity that the counties, the cities, and the local units themselves understand this process, realize why this is so important for them, have really the, you know, the will, the enthusiasm to do it themselves, to move things forward. No, let's just have a good paper. We did our homework then, and that's it. And then we can be the same as like everybody else, and hopefully we'll be the first ones to have this strategic plan developed. So, you know, this is annoying. What to do?
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Tanya. What you're raising is a lot of very difficult questions to answer, and I don't have a magic wand, but nevertheless, I'm going to start by being not that negative and pessimistic. First of all, we have a context in which institutional quality and government quality in many parts of Europe have deteriorated. And we're seeing it perhaps in this COVID situation, that countries that were once the let's say the most stable countries, the beacon of Europe, countries like, for example, Italy, Spain, France, the UK, Belgium, are the ones that are suffering the most with, in this case, governments that don't know and don't have a clue about how to do, and very often also societies not behaving in the right way. So there's a recommendation by the British government to stay at home, implemented very late with a prime minister that was keeping on saying we have to all get immunity, so the best thing is to get the virus and that's it. And then suddenly when they say, please stay at home, this is serious and you know what's happening everywhere, people just decide, and it was a very nice day, they just flock into the parks and make note. So it's in many places the situation is worse. However, having said that, the reaction in places like Croatia, the reaction in places like Slovakia, the reaction in places like Slovenia, in Greece, has been exemplary. And you can say, well, it's not doom and gloom everywhere. Now the question is, how can we benefit from this, and how can we make sure that we get the returns? And here's where I don't have the magic wand, but there are examples that can be used. The first thing is, I think I will insist in this effort that the important thing is that a lot of the money comes from outside. It's a transfer for development by the European Union. And there can be conditionalities attached to certain levels of, let's say, government quality and improvements in government quality that need to be applied, transparency and accountability, which at the moment hasn't been the case. Second, I always think that having all this consultation sort of system is better than not having it, despite the fact that you say normally is disregarded. But the fact that it's being undertaken makes it far more difficult to try to circumvent the, let's say, general opinions by groups that otherwise would have no voice. And then the third factor, I think, is purely by example. If there are parts of one country, let's say there are regions, there are cities within Croatia that use these systems of consultation, of participation, of accountability, of transparency in the whole development process, you're going to end up in a situation whereby if those places do better, then they might set the example that is going to be followed by everyone else. At the moment, you might say they pay lip service, and they say we have to do it because we have to do it, but we don't pay attention to them. But let's suppose that Rijeka starts doing it in a serious way, and as a result of it gets better far better results. If that sort of behavior then leads to greater economic growth, more employment generation, and it's also rewarded with more, let's say, better quality of life, but also more investment, etc. That might lead other parts of the country to decide, well, we might as well do the same because that's the best way forward.
True, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have that in mind. Yeah, I agree.
I would ask a question, Andrés. It was very, it was very interesting presentation, but unfortunately leaves us very in a bad mood in this wonderful day here, because I took a photo of one of your graphs. If you don't mind, I'll share it on Facebook about the quality of governance.
Please go ahead.
Where we are standing very, very bad, and we knew it before you said it, but then when you see it compared to others, then it really makes you depressed. And what colleague Malekovic was saying just before me, when you look at the situation around you, some days you don't know where to start, because besides all these people in the governance, in the institutions, besides that they are ignorant, they are also very full of themselves, let's say. They don't need anybody's advice, because when you contact them and you try to give some advice, free or mostly free, that's how we operate, then the talk is, okay, you don't know anything. So what my question would be, beside this comment, is where do you see the position of academia in such a context? You did give some insights at the end that we need to share our insights to inform better policies, but in the situation where the institutions are not very ear open to those suggestions, however data and knowledge they are based, what can an academia member or academia community do to maybe make that social capital change, and in some time even some changes in institutions?
Okay, so here it's it's also a difficult question to answer, but I think our main constituency in the field that we're working is fundamentally government. And you're talking about dealing with politicians, and of course we are in a situation, until recently I work in a country where one of the main ministers still in government is saying we had enough of experts, we don't need any more experts. Well, you didn't need experts, and you saw what now is the country in the whole of Europe with the worst trajectory in terms of reaction to COVID, the United Kingdom. So it gives us an opportunity. I always find that when you deal with decision makers, and of course the main problem is having access to decision makers, active decision at the moment, but that's three types. That those that know what they want to do and would use experts, if at all, more or less to rubber stamp what they want to do. These are the type of people you're never going to convince of doing anything. So that would be your decision, whether you are happy with what they are saying and you want to justify technically what they're saying, but you're not going to change anything. There's 1/3 of decision makers that think they know what to do, but still they're open to suggestions, so they're willing to listen. So you might sway, and they might have a clear idea of what they want to do, but they might say, how do I do it, and in which way do I do it? And then there's 1/3 of politicians, especially those that have been in office for a while, that have done or have tried to do whatever they wanted to do or what they could do, and either have achieved it or haven't managed, and they want to do something else. They're looking for ideas. I think you have to focus, and you have to try to identify these two last categories, because they are the ones that are genuinely open to having some small influence. And it's a process that takes time. It's not a process that happens overnight, but you have to keep on insisting. I mean, I've been around on this, and I think I now have a considerable policy influence. I'm not going to say political because it's not the case. I don't care about politics or any particular political party, but I like to improve the quality of life of individuals. So I have now an influence, but for many years I thought no, this is not going to happen. No one is listening to me. I'm just wasting my time. I should do like my colleagues that just sit down in the office and at home, and rather than just trying to bang on doors, and it's not going to happen. But suddenly it might happen overnight. And I'll tell you some examples which are just by chance. I was involved in the famous Barker report, now famous Barker report, which has led to the reform in the 2014. And I was involved in other reports, the reform of the cohesion policy in 2014. And I was involved in other reports before. When we wrote the report, Fabrizio Varca was the lead. He gave it to the commission. And at that time, Romano Prodi, who was the head of the commission, looked at it and he said, nice report. So what did he do? He shelved it. And that was what had happened with all the previous reports. So nice, but it's not going to happen. So we shelved it. And I was not surprised because I had been involved in other reports before, and that's what always happened. So no one cared. And so I said, well, I don't mind. I've been paid a bit, and I just go and do something else. But having said that, I must say that someone like Fabrizio, who's a politician himself, Fabrizio Varca, kept on banging doors. He went and tried to convince first the Poles to say, can you support my report? And the Poles said, no, we want to build more infrastructure. We don't want this bottom-up, place-based type of approach. Then he went to the Brits, and I said to Fabrizio, don't go to the Brits, because if you go to the Brits and the Brits say yes, no one's going to have it. He went to the Italians. I forgot to mention that he went to Italians first. After all, he's Italian. Of course, the government had changed and he found no support there. He went to the Spaniards, but the Spaniards did not want to listen. And suddenly, when he was about to give up, after 3 years of saying, we finished this in 2008, this is 2011, nothing's happening, and we're not getting, someone came, and it was the Germans. And the Germans, being all cynical, was saying, how can we keep on doing policy, in this case cohesion policy, without spending more money in a period of crisis? And someone pointed to saying, oh, maybe you can take a look at this Barker report, which advocates, among many other things, that we spent in a more balanced way, and we spent less money on infrastructure and more on place-based type of smart specialization type of policy. Although smart specialization is not in the report. And then the Germans said, oh, let's go and look at it. And within a year and a half, overnight, the whole process had transformed a report that was shelved and no one cared about into the mainstay of the second biggest reform of the structural funds in the European Union since the big one in 1989. So sometimes you have to keep on banging doors at the right places, and hoping that you're planting the seeds that someone will get eventually later on.
So persistence is the word.
You have to persist, and hopefully you'll be lucky one day.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer.
So, Zvonimir, you are going to ask.
Yeah, so Blanca,
Oh, first Zvonimir, then I, okay?
Okay.
Okay, so Croatia is a country that is similar to Spain, but even more, a lot of more dependent on tourism. Among European Union countries, we have the highest share of tourism in GDP, approximately 18%. And our region, Adriatic, our NUTS2 region, Adriatic Croatia, has even much higher share of tourism in GDP. And here in Croatia, we have as well a lot of cities and municipalities, 555 to be precise, 555. And basically, almost every city or municipality in Adriatic Croatia has its own tourist board. And I think that most of times those tourist boards are very small, have only one employee that's most of the time director of that tourist board. And I think, of course, that it's not a sustainable governance system in tourism. And I wonder what could be first step to improve that. Maybe Spain that has very that tourism is also important for Spain. Maybe is there any example to sort out such a situation to show some better governance in tourism?
Well, I am in Spanish. Thank you very much for joining me. I am Spanish, but I wouldn't recommend that you look into Spain for advice on how to deal with tourism. You don't want to do to your coast what we have done to our coast in Spain in many ways. Of course, what you're raising there is an important issue, which is an institutional issue. So what is the right scale for, let's say, tourist intervention, and how should we coordinate? I don't see a problem with having tourist boards at the local level. I think probably the good thing about tourist boards is that you have local municipalities and local cities being aware that tourism is important for them and making sure that they promote it. But of course, having a tourist board at the local level doesn't mean that you have to undercut what your neighboring city is doing or your other area. So you need a level of coordination. And of course, that coordination can be done at a regional level, because many of the cities in Dalmatia, many of the cities in Istria, for example, many of the in Dubrovnik would have similar problems and would need to have some sort of coordination. And on top of that, you need some sort of a strategic master plan in terms of tourism at the level of the whole country. How do you achieve that horizontal coordination with all that vertical coordination from local, let's say, tourist boards to regional tourist boards and to national tourist boards is something that, Blanca, I think you had a question.
Yeah, Andres, I want to thank you for your presentation. It's really interesting, and it opens many questions and it gives a lot of answers. But also, if I could summarize everything, so the infrastructure is important. If we think about the physical infrastructure, then we should think about the threshold of physical infrastructure. Like it is the prerequisite for development, but sometimes if we put a lot of money into infrastructure and forget everything else, then we are in problem. Okay, this is how I see it. But at the end, I want to ask about the quality of government. And did you, through your study and through everything you do for so many years in the context of the quality of government, are there some variables or different approaches in different countries and different regions to cope with this problem of ineffectiveness, of low indexes of quality of government? Or there is a general view, the problem can be solved with this way? Do we need tailor-made approaches to solve the ineffectiveness of government?
Okay, so yeah, first the summary of what you highlighted before, which is, yes, you need policies that are adapted to the conditions of specific groups of territories. So you need balanced and integrated policies that react to what the main deficiencies are. So if your main deficiency is lack of infrastructure, you have to put infrastructure without undermining what you're doing in human capital or innovation or institutional quality. If your main problem is institutional quality, you have to focus on that. But sometimes what you're going to have when you have deficiencies everywhere, you have to use your limited resources in an intelligent way. And the best way to do that is through a sound diagnosis, which is the technical part, but active participation of civil society in the whole process of the policy design. Then the question, is there an approach in terms of capacity building and institution? Yes, there's an approach, which is virtually no one does anything. Because no one, until very recently, has actually cared about institutional quality. We need an institutional quality mattered. But first, there was it was difficult to understand what institutional quality actually meant, how to intervene in that. And then, of course, you're asking very often governments to decide you have to improve yourselves because you're the main part of the problem. So in the end, no one was doing anything. Now we're realizing that we cannot go on like this because otherwise we're wasting precious limited resources. So we need to do other things. And this is where, more than following one example, I would put the example of the Basque Country in Spain, I would put the example of Emilia-Romagna in Italy, I would put the example of Estonia before, but it's a series of practices. So the idea that you need to, for example, encourage participation. Although Sanya says you have to be critical because sometimes it's just window dressing or paying lip service to something. In the end, you cannot go on just having people talk in groups, having a voice, and then ignoring them. You have to reduce red tape and cap the barriers. That has important impacts on transparency, accountability, and efficiency, on reducing transaction costs. How to achieve that? There are many ways of doing that. So better trained civil servants, better paid civil servants, etc. But the easiest and cheapest way these days is through e-government and making sure that you put everything in a transparent way online so that people can access. You can reduce red tape by having one-stop shops. So rather than going to 50 offices to open a business, you can go to one office that will deal with all the required documents in one morning or 2 mornings, and that's it. So these are the sort of things that need to be done, and they are not that difficult to implement. The main problem is that the barriers that are there, which are the, let's say, the institutional barriers, the social barriers, are very often high and difficult to overcome. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Andrés.
Okay. Maybe I can ask one question, Andrés. So, keeping in mind low quality of governance in a relatively well-developed part of Europe, like Italy, that has zero growth for the last 3 decades, can you please have some kind of link or some comment between informal and formal institution? Is there something about the culture, about the preferences, social values in some parts of Italy? Because it's quite, at least for me, it's quite difficult to explain why some parts in northern part of Italy has no demand for better quality of governments, even they have low or zero growth for the last 3 decades, as you said. So
no, it's one of the things that I find difficult to understand, because I think it's a very pertinent question. Because one of the main problems that used to explain the differences in terms of development between the north and the south of Italy was the difference in quality of government, that it was significantly higher in a well-governed, more efficient north, and it was much weaker in a less developed and poorly governed south. What you would imagine is that good practices would spread from the north to the south. What we have seen over the last 2 or 3 decades has been the opposite, that corrupt, nepotistic, clientelistic practices, inefficiencies have not spread from the south, but have been creeping up in the north. It was a big surprise when, let's say, in the 1990s, the corruption scam of Tangentopoli, which was bribes for construction. So that's why there was so much construction going on in certain parts of northern Italy, was because politicians and construction companies were getting a lot of work, living on bribes. Happened not in Palermo or not in Naples, it happened in Milan. And what we have seen over this period of time has been a deterioration of institutional quality that has had a significant negative impact on the economic performance, and especially on the capacity, the adaptability capacity of many parts of the north of Italy. So to the extent of which, for example, the openness to trade, which has facilitated the change and the adaptation of many Mittelstand German firms and made them much more competitive, in the case of Italy, has to a large extent completely wiped out the whole industrial tissue that was among the most efficient in Europe. And why is that? Well, you can say probably was a question of industrial structure, that many of the firms were in sectors of mid-tech and low-tech sectors that could not compete with China, with Romania, with Bangladesh. But it's also a lack of capacity to adapt that is very often linked to institutional rigidities. Sorry, we couldn't hear you.
Last survivors.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people in Croatia, at least what I think, have an anonymity towards bettering of institutions because it means going digital. And by going digital, it is inevitable that some people lose their jobs. So how can we explain to the people that that is a crucial cost of bettering of the institutions and governance?
Well, you're talking about one part of institutional improvement, which is, in this case, a government. And any sort of transformation implies there would be, in the short term, people that lose and people that win out of it. But this is a trade-off. And what you want to make sure is that you prepare societies to make sure that by doing that transformation, you win in the medium and long term collectively, that everyone wins. Because the alternative is that if you don't do the structural transformation, everyone loses out. So you might have some short-term gains and some short-term losses to win in the medium term, vis-a-vis the alternative, which is medium-term losses and long-term losses for all. How do you explain that? It's difficult, but the answer is, if you cannot, let's say, create a reduced red tape, because everyone is trying to protect their own turf and doesn't realize that there are other ways of doing things, these are people you really want to get rid of. Because otherwise, the solution is that the country or the city or the region is going to go worse and worse without any sort of structural change.
That makes absolutely sense. Thank you.
Anyone else? So it seems that we finished our overtime. Once more, thank you, Andrés, on your outstanding presentation.
Yes.
But exceptional webinars require more than just a great presenter. They need also the engaged viewers, and it seems that we had it all today. So thank you once more, and sorry for all technical problems, and hopefully you will join us soon in Split, and you will have opportunity maybe to see this sunny city again. So Andrés, thank you all the colleagues, thank you all the students, and hopefully see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and very nice to see you all. And hopefully I'll be able to see you very soon in Croatia in person. Okay.
We have a young student. See?
Bye, thanks.
Yeah.
Bye to all.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Sjajni ste vi svi. Bog, bye bye.
Bog Sanja, Bog svima.
Bog,
Ja gledam Josipovog sina ovdje, gleda.